All the best level-headed conversations start with just raw emotion. You're listening to A Christian and an Atheist Walk into a Bar. This is Jay from my cold dead hands, Stooksbury. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Ty, kill 'em all and let God sort 'em out, Gallenbeck. And probably not the most appropriate lead into this topic, but we're obviously going to be discussing one of the hottest political issues of our time right now, which that is the topic of guns and gun control.
That's right. Which I feel like if you're from Colorado, at some level, you're more in tune to this topic than a lot of places.
Yeah, especially for people our age, too.
I think so. There was something about being in high school when Columbine took place that puts gun violence on your radar more than probably any other generation, I think. And specifically, Colorado people who were alive and in high school during that time, it radically changed our world for a time period, I think.
Yeah, it taking place during such formative years, it's most likely going to have such a deep and lasting impact. But it is one of those moments in time where you remember where you were, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, like we all remember where we were during 9/11 and some of those types of major events. So, do you remember where you were when it happened?
I very much do. I can remember being in the tech lab. I was probably ditching the class I was supposed to be in, but was in the tech lab, and our school has this, they called it the fishbowl, which is like a tiered seating room with a projector and a screen, and they actually turned the news on in that room, and kind of everyone ended up huddled up in the fishbowl watching this kind of unfold in the news station coverage and everything, and just the utter awareness of this could have been us. This is our age group. Like this, it was just so close to home because it was Colorado and it was a high school. There was something very real about that moment for me. So, what about you?
Yeah. So I actually where I was going to high school was actually right down the street from Columbine. I went to Bear Creek, which was just a few miles away. And when they actually announced on CNN what school the shooting was taking place, they announced Bear Creek first. They had their reports messed up. So our family just was barraging our house with phone calls because they knew that name. And my mom taught at the same high school, too. So it was just this huge mess. But when it took place, I was in our newspaper room, and I was most definitely not in the class I was supposed to be, because if I was in the newspaper room, that meant I was not in the class, because that was also one of the few rooms that we had a TV that can get outside cable networks, and it was strange because we actually had friends that went to Columbine too, and this is going to sound really bad, but the circle of friends that I was hanging out with, fortunately, it took place on 420 because they were not in school at that time because they were off getting high somewhere. But the like you said, the whole specter of it though, just kind of, you can't really absorb it, right? Like it's just so crazy to think that could happen, because you think that of all the places, even if you didn't like school, you know, if you thought it was a terrible place to be, you still felt safe there. You didn't think that you were going to be gunned down, you know, in suburban Littleton, you know?
Yeah.
That's the sort of stuff that you think of in, you know, what it's like the stuff of movies, and, you know, that doesn't happen here. But, you know, since then, it's become this kind of reoccurring event that kind of copycats itself every time. And whenever it happens, it just basically makes it almost mandatory that we debate gun control
Right.
for a few months, and then we forget about it, and then it happens again, and then we debate it again, and then we forget
Right.
about it, and basically this kind of never-ending cycle, which is always interesting because it produces a pretty polarized conversation, you know?
Well, yeah, because the best time to have any conversation is in the heat of the moment because you're super level-headed and
Right.
everything.
Yeah.
And
All the best level-headed conversations start with just raw emotion.
I really hope sarcasm comes through on this because
Yeah.
otherwise people are going to be, they're right.
Yeah, you're right.
Someone's latching onto that right now. No, that is not what we're saying. But, and I mean, I know in my circle of friends that I run in, it's an interesting split of, I mean, I have friends that have grown up hunting that, do that religiously every season. I have friends that are on the PD and, they have an arsenal in their house. And then I have friends on the complete other side of the spectrum that are, my wife being one of them, that doesn't want to touch a gun and doesn't want to have anything to do with a gun, never has shot a gun, any of those things. And to see those two sides that so evidently rear their ugly head when something like this happens, and for it to be the same conversation every freaking time, I feel like there's got to be something we're missing here.
Right.
So, and I know you wrote an article about this stuff a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. And the sad thing is that I can reuse it. One of the best things about being a writer is that if you can ever create a piece of content that you can recycle year after year after year and it's still timely. It's unfortunately that my best one has to do with the gun control debate.
Right.
The article was titled "Gun Nuts versus Gun Grabbers," because that's basically what this debate boils down to every time, and it's just basically just like tribal identities, and whatever side you're on, and I guess technically I'm on the gun nut side. Because I think that I possess the right to bear arms, and I don't think necessarily that gun control legislation will fix anything. But if you lead off with that with someone who might be opposed to you, instantly you're labeled. You're a gun nut, or like I said, a gun grabber. So the gist of the article is basically pinning both of those sides against each other and focusing on kind of the erroneous talking points that each of them champion. Just to give an example, for the gun grabbers, which are always the gun control advocates, is that they tend to have a very negative view of guns and they've never actually used one before. So they tend to be a little uneducated on the nuances of them, and most likely would change their opinion after spending some time with someone who's educated or going to the gun range for an afternoon. And then also the gun nuts, which usually is the argument that they try to make, is that any time that this conversation comes up, this is going to be basically an all-out effort to take all the guns away from them personally. And I think those are always like the extreme cases, and they usually don't pan out either way, and that's part of the reason why nothing happens, right? Because they kind of deadlock, there's just this gridlock in terms of legislation, and we just basically each side throws up their hands and said, those people are crazy.
Right.
That other side's crazy, and that's why nothing will ever change, and that's the way it ends up being. And at the end of the day, it doesn't. The conversation just lacks nuance completely, because we fixate on things like school violence. They're the mass shooting type of event, and that makes up such a minute percentage of what gun violence is. It's something like mass shootings make up 2 to 3% of total gun violence in the U.S. But you'd think that all the schools of all the country are just being shot up on a regular basis, which, just to say flat out, no kid in any situation should ever feel threatened
No.
about the experiencing
No.
gun violence
Absolutely.
at all. And that 2 to 3% that takes place in schools in general, that's too much, period.
Way too much, yeah.
But it's just sad that takes up such a big portion of it, and there's much broader issues because of gun deaths. 2/3 of them happen to be suicide. A lot of them happen to be related to drug trade. There's a lot of different elements to it, and trying to come up with these like one size fits all pieces of legislation isn't going to solve it either.
Right. And I think that's one of the big problems is that they latch on to this 2 to 3% to try to make decisions based around this happening, where there's so much more going on. And I think, when you sit back and watch it, and I would consider myself pretty in the middle on this, really, because, I grew up shooting guns,
right.
Boy Scout, Eagle Scout.
You were an Eagle Scout?
I was an Eagle Scout.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
So Eagle Scout, went to the range, went hunting with my dad, my grandfather.
Right.
I've never actually shot never shot a licensed animal. I shot prairie dogs, I guess.
Yeah.
But I've never, had deer license, elk license, never got anything, but those kind of things. But did that. But also someone who, my wife's a teacher, so anything to keep her safe is definitely on the forefront of my mind. But I feel like what ends up happening here is it becomes guns kill people, people kill people, and it's like this. And I hate hearing the mental health debate,
right?
And how quickly that gets thrown out.
Yeah, people are quick with bumper stickers.
Oh man,
yeah.
And there's no insight. Before names have been released,
right.
I feel like people are saying, "Oh, this is a mental health issue."
Right.
You have no freaking clue what kind of issue this is.
Yeah.
And the way that we cookie cutter all of these to be the same. I have a big issue with that. That Columbine is the same as this, is the same as this, is the same as this. And I feel like if you took a close look at all of these, odds are real good. These are going to be very unique situations and very unique communities with very unique individuals.
Yeah.
And so to say this gun control issue is going to solve all of these problems across the board is asinine.
Right.
You're not going to solve it with one thing.
Yeah.
And so I think from my perspective, one, we need to take a look at, okay, where is the majority of gun violence taking place? And how do we start making that easier to deal with? You're not going to make it go away, but what are steps you can take to solve that piece?
Well, and I think it also takes a little bit of and I completely agree with you. It takes some creative thinking too, because I'm going to reference another article that I wrote too. One of the biggest forms of gun violence is actually related to the gun trade or to the drug trade, and that's because of the illicit nature of the majority of drugs in the United States. If there's a dispute that takes place in the black market, how are black market disputes handled?
Right.
Do you take them to court? No. It usually ends at the barrel of a gun, Right. And I actually think if you decriminalized a lot of drugs, and at least just start with marijuana in general. Again, we're getting back to that topic. But if you start treating drugs as a business component of it, but also treating addiction as a public health issue rather than a criminal issue, I actually think you'd see a huge decrease in gun violence, at least in that particular percentage of gun violence taking place. And I'm totally in agreement with you about or agreement, not agreements, with the mental health argument that usually is put forward. To me, I feel like it's just a dodge.
Right.
It's people that are really quick to say, "Oh, I already know what happened. The dude's crazy.
Right.
The dude's crazy, and he was on prescription drugs. I guarantee he's not on drugs. Or if he wasn't on drugs, he should have been on drugs."
Right.
And the why I get frustrated with is because you're trying to stigmatize mental health in general too. Is mental health an issue in our country?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But the vast majority of those who suffer from mental health are not violent people.
Right.
And you are already trying to almost criminalize these people already, and that's not going to make the situation any better.
Not at all.
Yeah, especially those who say that their mental health is the issue, and then they start cutting funding to a lot of things too. So you can't have it both ways all the time.
Yeah.
It's not the most intellectually honest position.
And and we talk about the extremes and the gun nuts that want their guns and are going to keep their guns at all cost and come at me, bro.
Wulan lobby.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the reality is, I mean, the Second Amendment's not going anywhere.
No. No. It'll take an act of God for that to go away.
Which that says a lot for Jay to say that statement, which means he doesn't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. But I think to have a realistic scope of this, but then we say that, and all of a sudden we're starting to see things, especially in the state of Colorado. You pointed this out to me. I didn't even know this, that there is local legislation taking place that is probably the most extreme we've ever seen.
Yeah. So just case in point, right now in Boulder, they are in the midst of so whenever something like a big ordinance takes place, they have to have the initial proclamation, and then they have to go through a first and second reading of it, and then it becomes law or official ordinance. And so they haven't, as of this recording, they have not done their first or second reading yet. But long story short, the city council in Boulder put out this public meeting notice that they were going to discuss an assault weapon ban. And it got a lot of press, and it got a lot of people showing up. And they basically put their ban, the ban that they're going to potentially put in place would ban anything above a 22 caliber rifle, which, I mean, I grew up with a little 22 pea shooter basically to shoot cans off the fence of my granddad's farm. And it's not this is the exact characterization of what gun rights advocates have always said. It's like they're coming for your guns, right? And this is like Boulder's Boulder. Boulder's going to do
Boulder's
Boulder.
A unique.
Yeah, and I think Boulder will always be like that. But it does set itself up as that precedent, right? It's like, and this is what they'll say. This is what we've been saying all along. They're going to ban this, and then they're going to come for it. Which technically, if this ordinance goes in place, if you're caught with anything like that, you can be in trouble for it, and they can confiscate your weapon, which is exactly what all the NRA messaging will want it to play out to be. And I don't think that's actually the vast majority of what gun control advocates are saying. Like I've had some friends who are very progressive that said, Boulder's crazy. Please don't think that this represents what we are advocating, So, yeah, it's again, the extremes are the ones that get the press coverage, and that's what the conversation pivots off of, you know?
And what I think is interesting about that situation specifically is you're going to see one of two storylines that get latched onto. Either A, all of a sudden, which I don't have stats in front of me, but all of a sudden, quotes, there's no gun violence in Boulder, and they're going to latch onto that because of this ban. Or there's going to be something's going to happen, and it's going to go on the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
Which none of that is helpful for anyone.
And none of it's actually intellectually honest either. Like there's no causation or correlation or anything like that.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guarantee you that's what everybody's looking for right now.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest issue with this whole issue. The biggest issue with this issue is that people are just waiting for that event to say, "Aha! Told you so," Yes. And that's not really intellectually honest. I think the one thing that I find really interesting about what's come out of this most recent one, though, which hasn't happened before, is the amount of youth activism.
I was going to say the same thing.
That has come out of it. And this is actually something that I've found myself on the opposite side of a lot of my gun nut friends. Because I'm at the end of the day, like, I'm always a youth advocate.
Right.
And the fact that kids are getting involved and that they're marching and they're organizing and they're doing a lot of stuff. And I know there's a lot of people that will push back and say, oh, they're pawns being pushed out in front of the audience. And there might be some of that element too, but man, the kids that they've gotten up on stage right now,
right,
just my jaw drops watching them. Like, it sends chills down my spine sometimes listening to them. And I don't necessarily even agree with them, you know? But the fact that I'm watching this generation mobilize right now gives me a lot of hope. And like I said, I don't necessarily agree with them, but watching this group of kids, who a lot of them, which I think is even funnier, I've heard a lot of people say, well, what is a 16-year-old going to do with an election? It's like, watch out. Yeah. 2020, they're going to be 18, And that's where that if you can see that trajectory take place, if that's the case, then 2020 might be a watermark year in terms of youth participation.
Well, and I think, myself as well, dealing with youth and working for them and being on their side and being a mentor and being a part of their lives. If you think they're pawns, have you ever tried to get a large group of high schoolers to do anything?
Thank you.
You can't do it.
No.
If they don't believe in it, and whatever reason they're believing in it, but if they don't believe in it, you're not going to get them to do crap.
Right. Like, get them to show up.
It's impossible.
I was like, oh my gosh, you got kids to show up at like 7 a.m. for something?
Yes.
Cheers to you. Whoever is your pawn master, you are a master in here.
Yeah, seriously. There is something so much bigger going on than just that.
Right.
And I agree. Like, and at this point, you've seen students on both sides of this.
That's very true.
That are speaking and that are involved and and for me, I think it's exciting to see them caring about this.
Right.
And I think you're going to see change. And like you said, whether it's now or whether it's in 4 years when they can vote, like, you're going to start to see some differences. And if they decide that this route, being active, being politically active, is a way that change happens, all of a sudden you're going to see a lot of differences in the way things are done, how campaigns are run. Right? There's a lot of things that could roll out from this. But when it comes down to just the gun thing, my wife's a teacher. I have one daughter in elementary school. Another one that will be in that school next year. They had a lockdown this year because there was a criminal suspected to be in the neighborhood who could be armed.
Right.
Nobody should be at school and feel unsafe.
Right.
So I don't know at this point what it looks like to fix that. But what I do know most is it's not the two sides you're seeing most vocally expressed.
Sure.
And so I think trying to figure out, okay, how do we take all guns and let me have an army in my house, people, and get them in a room to figure out how. Okay, let's look at the important thing here,
Right.
which is our kids in schools. How do we keep them safe? And what does that start to look like? And what does that conversation look like?
The most effective starting off point that at least what I've considered to be um, a good conversation starter, is to discuss the role of rights and responsibilities. So the way I see it, um, I consider rights and responsibility to be two sides of the same coin. You have the right to free speech. You have the right to say your opinions and things of that nature, but you have the responsibility to do it in a civil manner. Like you can't just make up stuff about people and get away with it. That's why we have laws in place for libel and things of that nature. You can't just put out outlandish lies. You still have to take responsibility for the things that you say, and you also have the right to say what you want, but you have to at least allow for people to retort as well.
Right.
And I feel the same way about the Second Amendment too. You have the right to bear arms, but the second that you show that you are not a responsible gun owner, you've lost that right.
Right.
So, uh, case in point, I had a good friend that lost a child because of a caretaker that they had left this little boy with, who left a handgun in a car, got out of the car, at a gas station or something like that, and the kid found the gun and blew his head off. You have shown that you are not responsible with firearms, therefore you've lost that right. And I think that there's ways of figuring that out before the kid blows his head off.
Yeah.
And I think leading up to that, there were some signs this guy's not responsible. He had a little bit of a record before too that should show that this guy shouldn't have a gun.
Right.
And now that doesn't mean he can't get a gun, because if a person wants a gun, he'll get a gun regardless of regulations. But it shouldn't be easy for him in the same space.
Control what you can control. I think in that.
Yeah.
And I think, we have a right to drive vehicles, but there's an age limit. There's tests you have to pass, all of those kind of things.
Right.
And I think those are some very simple things that on either side, gun nut or what are they, gun nut, gun grabbers, I think on either side could agree to some things along those lines.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a background check right now, but my wife could pass a background check, but she wouldn't know how to load a clip to save her life.
Sure.
So should she handle a gun? No, probably not.
Yeah.
Not at this time. Not without some training.
Right.
So, what does that kind of stuff look like as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, and the one thing I would argue with is that we don't have a right to drive. We have the privilege.
Wow.
But either way.
Yeah. All right,
just
fair.
picking
Fair. No, that's fair.
But either way.
I was
yeah.
trying to make an analogy.
Which we always, that's another thing. We always compare guns and cars. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it all starts with at least finding common ground, which is not happening at all, because we've already created our own barriers. We already have our talking points ready. Like they're like 3x5 cards that we keep in our pocket for when a gun violence event takes place. So we're ready just to whip them out. And be like, let's see, is this mental health? Is this a terrorist? Which one is it?
Yeah.
And it's really frustrating. So I don't know really what the actual answer is, because I don't think there is like I said before, a one size fits all solution to this.
Right.
Because I do think there's a lot of cultural elements that we need to at least take into consideration too. Because I do think, like, even as someone who advocates for gun rights, I do think we have kind of a toxic culture about guns. The way we kind of glorify them, and Sometimes I think we have a little bit of a fetish about them too. But it, it just really, it's not a healthy relationship sometimes. But and that usually comes out in the conversation that's never really that productive either.
Right. Well, and I think it'd be interesting to take a look with so many things that are considered faux pas or off topic. If as a culture we took an proactive education standpoint,
Yeah.
how it would change and shape how those things were dealt with.
Right.
If you took a proactive stance on educating people on guns, even in high school, like how does that change how that's done? I think money. If we took a proactive stance, which it's starting to come around, but that's an easier topic to like integrate and think is important. But when I was in high school, that wasn't a topic, and if it was, how would it have changed my future and how I dealt with those things?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you were able to do that with guns and other things, you may see a difference in how they're portrayed. If you're only getting your education, you actually introduced me to the song that if a man gets his education from only one book, he should be feared.
Mm-hmm.
And so that idea that if you're only getting your education from one place, regardless of what that place is, it's not in check. It's one-sided. And so if that's true with guns, if these kids are only getting an education about guns from their parents, that view could be very, very skewed. But if they have the opportunity to get an education from multiple angles and see multiple things, it allows them to better create their own stance on that. And as we've seen, these kids are not dumb.
No.
They're very intelligent.
Yeah.
And they have the ability to craft their own decisions. But they have to be given that voice. They have to be given that opportunity. And if you're one of those people that's saying, oh, they just shouldn't be marching, no, they should be, but they should also be hearing from multiple sides and multiple angles.
And there's two parts to this youth movement that I want to address. And the first part is that leading up to this point, every characterization about this current younger generation is that they are lazy and entitled and they eat Tide Pods, like there's all these like just gross characterizations, and then suddenly they're like, okay, I'll call a spade. I'll get up and I'll speak in front of a crowd of thousands of people, and I'll do it with like just eloquence
grace.
and man, just some of those speeches. And then now they're like, wow, what do these kids know? Like you can't have it both ways.
No.
Like we're either the laziest generation or you just don't want to hear what they have to say.
Right. We're either Tide Pod eaters or we're smarter than you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, though, I think the most important thing, and I think this is something I experienced in my own activism too, is that you start off as a young person, you're just hopelessly idealistic,
right?
And then you end up going through the process. You rage against the machine, and then you realize the machine is this horrible entity that just drains the soul out of you. And yeah, the atheist said soul, but it makes you jaded, and it makes you really just kind of annoyed by the whole process. But ultimately, though, it's an important process to learn. You need to learn how these types of things work, because to make change happen, you need to learn that it's more than just having an idea. It's actually organizing around that idea. It's about trying to not only get like-minded people to buy into that idea, but also to get people who probably are not like-minded but buy into you to get into that idea, and it's this process of persuasion and information and being educated and networking, and it's this really great learning experience that's not only just good in terms of learning the civic process, but it's just great in terms of like professional development. You know, you're learning public speaking and like all these things that these kids right now, holy cow, watch out for them in 5 years. I mean, I honestly would tell them skip college.
Right.
Just keep doing what you're doing, because what you're doing is actually more valuable than you'd get in a college classroom. Like what you're getting in firsthand experience, like you'll never have this recreated in a classroom.
Yeah.
But it's a very important process that I think more young people should be introduced to it at a young age, so that they know how to navigate the system well before they're old and jaded like I am.
Well, and let's not stop this at young people. Like
everybody. Yes, yeah, exactly.
Like the fact that these kids are willing to express an ideal face to face with someone to receive the backlash that comes with that.
Oh yeah.
And probably to learn and grow from that, because as a high schooler, I would have said and been very passionate about some things that, looking back on now, same. I was kind of an idiot. But if you don't do that, if you don't go through that experience, you're not going to get that education process.
Right.
Where when you sit in your own little bubble and are just convinced of what you know and that is right, especially in a town like the one we live in, you are missing out on 99% of the world. And there is so much more and so much bigger that no matter which side of this gun issue you fall on, you have stuff to learn.
Right.
And when I sit in a room with my gun-loving policeman friend who's got more guns than I have bottles of whiskey.
That's a lot of guns.
That is a lot of guns.
I'm looking at your collection right now, and man,
which that statement is probably accurate. But I learn things, and I learn about the process, and I learn about how much he cares about them, and what he's gone through. And when I sit with people who want nothing to do with guns because of a tragedy that happened way too close to home for them, I learn things. And I think those people would be great to get in a room together because they would learn from each other.
Right.
And I think that's where all of this has to boil down to. Like, you have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to speak, which is what these kids, back to that, what these kids are showing us is that they are willing to get in front of someone. They're not just tweeting anymore, which I don't think high school kids actually tweet anymore either. I
don't know what they do now.
No, but but they are. They're up. They're in front of people. They're making a difference. They're making change.
Yeah.
Which, if you're sitting behind a keyboard bashing that and you're not willing to do the same thing, then get out.
Yeah, you're part of the problem.
Yes.
Yeah. And you gave me a really good idea too for something that I think would make like kind of an interesting segment. You know the game Taboo, right? Mm-hmm. So you have like a series of words that you can't say.
Right.
What if you set up a gun nut and a gun grabber in the same room?
Yeah.
And you had a set of cliches
that you couldn't use.
That you can't use.
I love it.
Like guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Wrong.
You lost. You're out. You lost. Or please think of the children. Like as if gun control. Mental health. Yeah, exactly.
Can't use that one.
You can't use that one. Yeah. And you actually force them to like back up their claims.
Yeah.
With facts, or
AR rifles should be outlawed. That can't be talked about.
Or they had to concede certain points. Like that's the way adults have conversation and decisions are made. So that's what you do. Gun control taboo.
I would love to see that actually take place, but I don't think it's happening.
Somebody way more creative and a lot more resources should make that happen.
That's right. So, yeah, I'm trying to think of like who could be Ellen. If you are listening to this,
first give us 5 stars.
Yeah,
just share our podcast.
Have us on the show.
Yeah,
let's not be greedy.
Just throwing out an idea.
You could facilitate that. This could be your newest game, Ellen. You could sit down people on different sides and give them a list of cliches. It doesn't even have to stop at gun nuts.
Right.
You could. All right, now we're just being desperate. Okay.
Ellen, the fate of the gun control debate rests upon you right now. If you're listening to this.
That's right. I don't think that's true. Don't put that on any one person. So. All right. Hey,
I think that's a good segue.
That's right. We're back. If you couldn't tell, it is great to be back and talking about this stuff. And to sit down, like, I mean, I haven't seen Jay in a month,
I know.
Which is crazy.
I missed you.
I know. I feel like we should hug right now, but it's an audio medium, so that would lose all impact.
We'll make a video and share
it. This may or may not happen. But,
likely story. Mental health.
That's right. So if you have enjoyed this, make sure you like us on, Facebook, Instagram, follow us those places. Find us on iTunes. It took us an act of God, or an act of, I don't know what that would be.
Evolution. Because it took a really long time.
Yeah. To get on iTunes, but we're finally there. Give us a review, 5 stars if you like us, please. If you don't like us, send us a message. We are not experts at this by any means. At least not the podcast part. We may be experts in the drinking category by this point. But let us know what kind of topics you'd like to hear 2 very different people talk about. Let us know if you have conversations where you've decided to sit down with someone that has different views from you and how that turned out. And Jay, close us out.
Thanks again for listening to a Christian and an atheist walk into a bar where we bridge the religious divide one adult beverage at a time.
That's right. Cheers.